The village sat quietly beside the grey coastline. Cold wind moved through the empty streets every evening. At the end of the oldest road stood a forgotten house. Its windows were covered with dust and salt from the sea. The gate leaned sideways like it had not been touched for years. Nobody lived there anymore. At least that was what the villagers claimed. But every morning fresh flowers appeared on the porch. Sometimes roses, sometimes white lilies. Always fresh, always carefully arranged. Nobody knew who left them there. Children avoided the road completely. Older villagers lowered their voices whenever the house was mentioned. Some refused to even look toward it. For nearly 20 years the mystery remained untouched. Then Clara Bennett arrived in the village. She came carrying a notebook and an old camera bag. Clara worked as a journalist in the city. She searched for stories people tried to forget. The moment she heard about the flowers, she became interested. The bakery owner who rented her a room warned her immediately. He said the house only brought trouble. He said the last reporter who investigated left after 3 days. Clara asked why. The old man only shook his head slowly. That night, Clara stood near her window looking toward the distant house. Fog rolled through the road quietly. The empty porch barely appeared through the mist, but even from far away she could see them. Fresh flowers resting beside the front door. The next morning Clara woke before sunrise. The village streets were still empty and silent. She carried her notebook and walked toward the abandoned house alone. Cold fog drifted between the trees beside the road. The closer she came, the quieter everything felt. Even the sound of the ocean disappeared. Fresh white flowers rested neatly on the porch steps. Drops of water still clung to the petals. Someone had placed them there recently. Clara examined the ground carefully. No footprints remained in the dirt, no tire marks, nothing. The front door was locked tightly with rusted chains. Dust covered every window from the inside. The house looked completely untouched, yet the flowers were always new. Clara photographed the porch from several angles. As she lowered the camera, she noticed movement nearby. An elderly woman watched her from across the street. The woman looked frightened. Clara approached her slowly and introduced herself. The woman hesitated before speaking. She said, "The house once belonged to Eleanor Vale, a quiet woman who rarely left the village. Nearly 20 years earlier, Eleanor vanished during the middle of winter. A week later, her husband disappeared too. Police searched the cliffs and forests for months. Nothing was ever found. After that, strange things began happening around the house. Lights appeared in empty rooms late at night. Some villagers heard footsteps inside even when the doors were locked. Then the flowers started appearing, every single morning without fail. Clara asked if anyone had ever waited outside overnight. The woman nodded slowly. Several people tried years ago, but none of them stayed until sunrise. They always heard something moving behind them in the dark. Something close enough to breathe beside their ears. The old woman suddenly stopped talking. Her eyes fixed on the house behind Clara. Clara turned around quickly. For a brief moment she thought she saw someone standing upstairs behind the dusty window, but when she looked again, the room was empty. Clara spent the afternoon inside the village library. The building smelled of old paper and seawater. A weak lamp flickered above the wooden tables. The librarian brought her several dusty newspaper boxes from storage. Most articles mentioned Eleanor Vale only briefly. She was described as quiet and polite. She often walked alone near the cliffs at sunset. Her husband, Thomas Vale, worked repairing fishing boats near the harbour. Neighbours claimed the couple rarely argued in public. But one article mentioned shouting, heard from the house during the week. Eleanor disappeared. The article ended suddenly after 2 paragraphs. The remaining section had been cut away completely. Clara searched through more papers. Several pages were missing from different newspapers. Entire reports had vanished. Someone had removed them carefully years earlier. The librarian seemed nervous watching Clara investigate. He admitted. Many people wanted the story forgotten. The disappearances frightened the village badly. Tourists stopped visiting for years afterward. Some families even moved away completely. Clara asked if police ever found evidence inside the house. The librarian hesitated before answering. He said officers searched it many times, but nothing unusual was ever discovered. No blood, no signs of struggle, no bodies. Only flowers left on the porch every morning afterward. As evening arrived, Clara uncovered one final article hidden inside another folder. The paper described a local man named Samuel Harper. He disappeared the same week as Eleanor. The article called him a close family friend. But someone had circled his photograph heavily with black ink, almost angrily. Clara stared at the picture carefully. Samuel looked tall and thin. He wore a long, dark coat in the photograph, the same coat Clara thought she saw through the fog earlier that morning. A cold feeling moved through her chest. Outside the library window, evening fog slowly covered the village streets again. Clara decided to wait outside the house that night. She brought a flashlight, her camera, and a thick coat against the cold wind. The village became silent after midnight. Only distant waves crashed against the cliffs below. Clara hid behind an old stone wall across from the porch. Hours passed slowly. Fog drifted across the empty road in pale waves. The abandoned house stood completely dark. No lights appeared inside. No movement came from the windows. By 4 in the morning, Clara could barely feel her hands. Then she heard footsteps, slow, steady, coming from somewhere inside the fog. A tall figure emerged from the mist, wearing a long dark coat. Their face remained hidden beneath a hood. The person carried a bouquet of white lilies carefully in both hands. Clara stayed completely still. The figure walked directly to the porch without hesitation. Almost like they had done it hundreds of times before, they placed the flowers gently beside the front door. For a moment, the figure stood there silently staring at the house. Then, church bells suddenly rang across the village. The loud sound echoed through the fog. Clara looked away only for a second. When she turned back, the figure was gone. The road stood empty again. Her breathing quickened. She rushed toward the porch and searched the area with her flashlight. Fresh footprints marked the wet dirt beside the steps. Large boots. Deep impressions. Clara followed them quickly through the village streets. The footprints moved toward the old church near the cliffs. Rain began falling lightly from the dark sky. The trail continued through the cemetery behind the church. Rows of old gravestones appeared through the fog. Then, the footprints suddenly stopped beside a grave covered with fresh flowers. Clara raised her flashlight slowly toward the stone. The name carved into it made her freeze. Eleanor Vale. Rain continued falling softly across the cemetery. Clara stared at the gravestone in silence. The stone looked old and weathered, but the dirt around it had been disturbed recently. Fresh mud surrounded the edges like someone had visited only hours earlier. Clara knelt beside the grave carefully. There was no date of death beneath Eleanor's name. Only her name alone carved into the stone. That detail unsettled her immediately. Most graves in the cemetery carried full dates. This one did not. Clara photographed everything with shaking hands. As she stood up, she noticed another bouquet resting beside the grave. The flowers were still dry despite the rain. Someone had placed them there recently. A cold breeze moved through the cemetery trees. Then Clara heard footsteps nearby. She turned quickly with her flashlight raised. Nothing appeared between the gravestones, but she could feel someone watching her. The sensation stayed heavy in the darkness around her. Clara hurried toward the church entrance. An old light glowed faintly inside. She pushed open the wooden door carefully. The church was empty except for an elderly priest cleaning candles near the altar. He looked surprised to see her there so late. Clara asked him about Eleanor's grave immediately. The priest became silent for several seconds. He admitted the grave was never official. No body had ever been buried there. Villagers placed the stone years ago simply to remember her. Clara asked who still visited it regularly. The priest avoided answering. Instead, he warned Clara to leave the story alone. He said some grief never disappears. Some guilt survives longer than death itself. Before Clara could ask more questions, the church lights suddenly flickered. A loud noise echoed from outside near the cemetery gate. Clara rushed back into the rain. The gate swung slowly in the wind. Beyond it, a dark figure walked away through the fog wearing a long coat. Clara shouted for them to stop. The figure never looked back. The next morning, the storm finally passed. Grey clouds still covered the coastline. Clara returned to the church shortly after sunrise. The elderly priest sat alone near the front pews. Dark circles rested beneath his tired eyes. He looked like he had not slept at all. This time he agreed to speak with her, slowly, carefully. He remembered the night Eleanor disappeared better than anyone else. Heavy snow had buried the village that evening. Most families stayed indoors beside their fires. Around midnight, the priest heard shouting coming from Eleanor's house. A man screamed angrily. Then glass shattered somewhere inside. After that, everything became silent again. Hours later, someone knocked on the church door before sunrise. The priest opened it, expecting a traveler from the storm. Instead, he found a man standing there covered in snow and mud. The man wore a dark coat. His hands trembled badly. The priest noticed dark stains across his sleeves. At first, he thought it was dirt. Later, he realized it looked more like blood. The stranger asked if the church basement was still unlocked. Before the priest could answer properly, the man walked away toward the cemetery. The snowfall hid his footprints almost immediately. The priest never saw his face clearly through the storm, but he believed the man was Samuel Harper. Clara asked why police never learned this information. The priest lowered his eyes quietly. He admitted he stayed silent out of fear. Several villagers claimed strange things happened after the disappearances. People heard footsteps outside their homes at night. Flowers appeared on windowsills. Doors opened by themselves. Fear spread through the village quickly. The priest believed someone wanted the truth buried forever. Before Clara left, the priest handed her a small rusted key. He said it had been found inside the church years earlier after the storm. Nobody knew what it opened, but the priest always suspected it belonged to Eleanor's house. Clara stared at the key in her hand. A cold feeling moved through her chest again. She already knew where she was going next. That night, Clara returned to the abandoned house alone. Fog drifted low across the empty road again. The porch flowers had changed overnight. Fresh red roses rested beside the front door now. Clara unlocked the rusted side gate quietly and stepped onto the property. The old house creaked softly in the wind. Every window remained dark. She found a broken kitchen entrance around the back. Dust covered the floor inside like untouched snow. The air smelled damp and rotten. Clara moved carefully through the hallway with her flashlight raised. Most rooms looked completely abandoned. Furniture sat beneath white sheets. Spiderwebs filled the corners, but something felt wrong immediately. A thin trail through the dust stretched down the hallway floor. Someone had been walking there recently. The footprints led upstairs. Clara followed them slowly. The wooden steps groaned beneath her feet. At the top of the stairs, she heard faint music playing somewhere nearby. A soft melody echoed through the darkness. She followed the sound toward the final bedroom. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the room looked untouched by time. The bed remained neatly made. Old perfume bottles still rested beside a mirror. Fresh flowers filled glass jars near the window. A small music box turned slowly on the dresser by itself. Clara approached carefully and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of Eleanor Vale smiling beside a tall young man. Samuel Harper. Clara searched the room more closely. Near the fireplace, she noticed loose floorboards hidden beneath an old rug. She pulled them open carefully. Dozens of letters rested inside, wrapped with faded ribbon. Every envelope carried Eleanor's name written neatly by hand. Clara opened the first letter slowly. The words inside immediately changed everything she thought she knew. The letters were written by Samuel Harper. Each one sounded deeply personal. He wrote about meeting Eleanor beside the cliffs years earlier. He described how lonely she often seemed inside the village. In one letter, he called her the only beautiful thing left in his life. Another begged her to leave the village with him forever. Clara read through the pages carefully beneath the flashlight beam. The relationship between them became impossible to ignore. Samuel loved Eleanor for years in secret. Some letters sounded hopeful. Others sounded desperate. Then the tone suddenly changed. The final letters became darker and more frightened. Samuel warned Eleanor repeatedly about her husband, Thomas. He claimed Thomas had discovered their meetings near the cliffs. One letter mentioned violent arguments inside the house late at night. Another said Thomas had started following Samuel through the village. The final unfinished letter shook Clara the most. Samuel wrote that Eleanor planned to leave the village during the winter storm. He promised to meet her at midnight near the church. But the letter ended suddenly after one final sentence. He knows everything now. Nothing else followed. No signature. No ending. Clara lowered the papers slowly. Rain began tapping softly against the bedroom windows outside. For the first time, she wondered if Eleanor's husband had truly been the danger. Maybe Samuel had only tried protecting her. Then Clara noticed something else hidden beneath the letters, an old newspaper clipping folded carefully in half. The article described Samuel's disappearance after Eleanor vanished, but someone had written words across the photograph, in dark ink. "I never left." Clara felt a chill move through the room. At that exact moment, the music box downstairs began playing again by itself. The melody echoed slowly through the empty house below her. Clara froze beside the bedroom doorway. The music downstairs grew louder, slow, uneven, like someone was turning the handle manually. She slipped the letters into her bag quietly and stepped into the hallway. The house had become completely silent again. No wind, no rain, only the distant melody below. Clara walked downstairs carefully with her flashlight shaking in her hand. Each wooden step groaned beneath her weight. The front hallway looked empty when she reached the bottom floor. But the music box now sat open on the entrance table. Clara knew she had left it upstairs. A fresh bouquet of lilies rested beside it. Water still dripped from the stems onto the wood. Someone else was inside the house with her. Clara turned slowly toward the dark living room doorway. For a brief second, she saw a figure standing there motionless, tall, wearing a long dark coat. Then lightning flashed outside the windows. The room became empty again. Clara rushed toward the doorway with her flashlight raised. Nobody stood inside, but muddy footprints covered the floorboards, leading toward the basement door. The door stood slightly open. A cold smell drifted upward from below. Clara remembered the rusted key in her pocket immediately. She followed the footprints down the narrow basement stairs. The walls grew damp and colder with every step. At the bottom, she discovered another locked metal door hidden behind old shelves. The rusted key fit perfectly. The lock clicked loudly in the silence. Clara pushed the door open slowly. A hidden room waited behind it. Dust covered most of the furniture inside. But the walls were filled with photographs. Dozens of them. Every picture showed Eleanor and Samuel together. Some looked happy. Others captured violent arguments near the cliffs and harbor. Near the far wall, Clara found a damaged journal resting beside an oil lamp. The name Eleanor Vale was written across the cover. Clara opened it carefully. The first pages described secret meetings with Samuel. The later pages sounded terrified. Eleanor wrote that Samuel had become obsessed with protecting her. She feared he would never let her leave the village alone. The final page ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. Dark stains covered the paper beneath the unfinished words. Then Clara heard footsteps directly above her. Slow footsteps moving across the floor upstairs. Clara closed the journal quickly. The footsteps above her continued moving across the house. Slow, heavy, almost deliberate. She turned off her flashlight immediately. Darkness swallowed the hidden room completely. Only faint light from the basement stairs remained visible. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Silence filled the house again. Clara barely breathed. Then the basement door upstairs creaked open slowly. Wood groaned above her head. Someone had entered the basement. Clara gripped the journal tightly against her chest. Careful footsteps descended the stairs, one by one. The figure carried no flashlight. Only darkness moved toward her through the basement corridor. Clara backed deeper into the hidden room. Her heart pounded painfully. Then an old voice finally broke the silence. "You should not have opened that room." The voice sounded weak, tired, but calm. A tall, elderly man stepped into the doorway, wearing the same dark coat Clara had seen through the fog. Grey hair rested against his shoulders. Rainwater dripped from the edges of his coat onto the floor. He looked directly at the journal in Clara's hands. His expression filled with sadness immediately. Clara asked if he was Samuel Harper. The old man nodded slowly. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel walked toward the photographs on the wall. He stared at Eleanor's face quietly. "She deserved better than this village," he whispered. Clara demanded to know what really happened during the storm 20 years earlier. Samuel closed his eyes heavily, he admitted. Eleanor planned to leave town with him that night. But Thomas discovered everything before she could escape. A violent argument began inside the house during the snowstorm. Samuel claimed Thomas attacked him first. Eleanor tried stopping the fight. Then she fell. Samuel's voice broke as he described her striking the fireplace stone. "She died before either of us understood what happened," he said softly. Clara asked what happened to Thomas afterward. Samuel stared silently toward the darkness upstairs. He wanted the whole village to know what I had done, he answered. So I ran. Outside the basement, thunder rolled across the coastline again. Samuel sat heavily beside the basement wall. For the first time, he looked truly exhausted. Years of fear and guilt rested across his face. Clara kept the journal close while listening carefully. Samuel explained that Thomas chased him through the village after Eleanor died. The storm grew worse every minute. Snow covered the roads and cliffs completely. Samuel ran toward the coastline trying to escape. Thomas followed him, carrying a lantern and shouting for help. Near the cliffs, the ground became dangerously slippery. Samuel claimed Thomas tried grabbing him near the edge. Both men lost their footing during the struggle. Samuel barely managed to hold onto the rocks below. Thomas disappeared into the darkness beneath the cliffs. The ocean swallowed him before sunrise. Samuel returned to the village, hours later covered in mud and blood. Terrified villagers saw him wandering through the fog afterward. That was when the rumors truly began, Samuel admitted. He secretly buried Eleanor near the church cemetery himself. He could not leave her body abandoned in the house. But fear stopped him from confessing to police afterward, so he hid instead. Years passed quietly while the village slowly forgot the truth. Samuel stayed hidden inside the abandoned house many nights. Sometimes he lived near the cliffs, sometimes inside empty fishing cabins near the harbor. But every week he returned with flowers for Eleanor, the only thing he believed she still deserved. Clara asked why he never left the village completely. Samuel looked toward Eleanor's photographs again. Because she never left either, he whispered. Suddenly, bright lights flashed through the basement windows. Voices echoed outside the house. Police cars surrounded the property. Clara realized someone must have followed her earlier that night. Samuel stood slowly as officers entered the first floor above them. He did not look frightened, only tired. Clara asked him to surrender peacefully. Samuel gave a faint, sad smile. Then the basement lights suddenly went dark. A loud crashing sound echoed somewhere upstairs. Officers shouted through the house immediately. By the time Clara reached the hallway again, Samuel Harper was gone. Police searched the abandoned house until sunrise. Officers checked every room, hallway, and hidden space. They searched the cliffs beside the coastline for hours. Samuel Harper was nowhere to be found. Some officers believed he escaped through the old storm tunnels beneath the village. Others thought he vanished into the forests near the cliffs. Nobody could explain how an elderly man disappeared so quickly. Clara remained inside the house while investigators examined the basement. The hidden photographs and Eleanor's journal changed the entire case. For the first time in 20 years, the village finally learned the truth. Eleanor Vale died during the violent argument inside the house. Thomas disappeared during the chase near the cliffs afterward, and Samuel spent decades trapped by guilt and fear. The story spread through the village quietly by afternoon. Some people pitied Samuel. Others still considered him dangerous. But nobody denied the mystery anymore. As evening approached, workers removed the police tape from the property. The abandoned house stood silent once again beside the empty road. Clara packed her notes and camera before leaving town. Before stepping into the taxi, she looked toward the house one final time. Something near the porch caught her attention immediately. Fresh white lilies rested beside the front door, perfectly arranged. Still wet from the morning rain, Clara slowly walked closer. No footprints surrounded the flowers. No sign of anyone nearby. Only silence filled the road. A cold wind moved through the trees softly. Then Clara noticed a small folded note hidden beneath the bouquet. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Only 4 words were written inside. She was never alone. Clara looked toward the dark upstairs window instinctively. For a brief second she thought she saw someone standing behind the dusty glass. A tall figure wearing a long dark coat. Then the curtain moved gently, and the figure disappeared again.